Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here with you. Like it says, I am an assistant professor of history at WSU Tri-Cities, and I'm assistant director of the Hanford History Project. What that is it is a DOE-funded effort to collect and preserve the history of the Hanford Site off the Hanford Site. What Hanford Site is a restricted federal site. And so what we do for the DOE is we manage their historic Hanford collection. This is a collection of almost 3,000 individual artifacts from the Hanford Site, from the plutonium production process, from things as mundane as office furniture of the 1940s, all the way to specialized items in that process. Everything we have is cleared for public release, so it's all clean, as it were. And we care for that offsite so that it's publicly accessible, and we work with museums around locally and around the country to when they want to do exhibitions on Hanford. We have artifacts for them to tell that story. In addition, we have thousands of images, many of which some of which are in this presentation. We've also ran an oral history project since 2013, interviewing former Hanford workers, their families, interviewing people of the pre-Manhattan Project communities, the towns of Richland and Hanford and White Bluffs that were bought out from their land and forced to leave, in addition to a couple interviews with people affected by Hanford. Because of our funding, we often have had barriers. Because our funding comes from DOE, we've often had barriers in reaching out to tribal groups and downwinders, and other institutions have collected some of those stories. Downwinder stories are available at Eastern Washington and UW archives. And so we have focused our efforts on the people kind of in the Tri-Cities to tell that story, partially because that's what we're funded to do. In addition to all that work that I do as the assistant director, and I'm the archivist of our project, so primarily the oral histories and the photos and the documents are my purview. In addition to that, I'm also a docent at the Manhattan Project National Historical Park, Hanford unit, where I offer tours. I work with other docents to offer tours of the B reactor and the pre-Manhattan Project tours, and I'm also the president of the B Reactor Museum Association, a nonprofit dedicated to first preserving the B reactor from demolition, and now that it's part of the park, supporting the park through fundraising, through gift sales and things like that to support interpretation out at the B reactor. So this is the Hanford Site. What you see here is roughly 680 square miles of land. This was the land that was everything here in this kind of ziggy boundary here is everything that was taken in early 1943 to be part of the Hanford Site. This is roughly half the size of Rhode Island. Just north of the Tri-Cities, Richland is here, Kennewick and Pasco over here. And this area, the Hanford Site, you notice that there's this kind of greenish area, and that is all what was buffer zone. That was taken as kind of a security barrier that goes up to Rattlesnake Mountain, Rattlesnake Hills, Saddle Mountain, so the Saddle Mountains up above, and then the Wallook Slope, basically taken as buffer zone. And all of that land has been, since the shutdown of Hanford in the late 80s, that land has been returned to public or private management. So it's not managed by DOE. This area, for example, is the Arid Lands Ecology Reserve, managed by Fish and Wildlife. Some of the Saddle Mountains and Wallook Slope is actually under private ownership, agriculture, grapes, Wallook Slope wine. And then the section of the river in this area, obviously the blue, is part of the Hanford Reach National Monument created in 2000 by President Clinton, which is the 51 miles of the Hanford Reach, this area where the Columbia River approaches its natural flow rate. So it's this 51-mile stretch, the undammed stretch of the river. Also a very important area of the Columbia for salmon spawning because it's undisturbed from dams. And again, it has that natural flow rate that's very important. And it's a major recreational area. People now, and for the past couple of decades, can recreate all the way up the Columbia, drive boats even next to the site. So a very popular area for fishing and recreation. The kind of central area here, this yellowish color, is the site as it is today, the boundaries of the site today, roughly 400 some odd square miles and some change. And that's broken into 3 major areas. Along the river is the 100 areas, where Hanford's 9 reactors are located. 3 reactors built in the Manhattan Project, that's B, D, and F. And it's Cold War era reactors. C, D, R, the R stands for replacement, H, N, K East, and K West. All of those reactors built to produce plutonium. All of them, 8 of them of the same design. Again, a production reactor built to produce plutonium using water as the coolant, water coming in, passing through, and then going out to be returned to the river. The 9th reactor, the N reactor, which N stands for new, was what's called a dual purpose reactor. It produced plutonium as well as energy. And considering that energy reactors and weapons reactors are 2 different processes, the N reactor kind of did both of those not so well. Energy reactors want the fuel in as long as possible to make a lot of heat. Plutonium production demands that the fuel be ejected when it has the greatest amount of plutonium, which is often just a couple weeks to a couple months into loading. So it's getting a little technical, but that's what the 9 reactors did, and they're all on the river because, again, they all needed water, right? Water is their main coolant. And so then the other areas are the 200 area, this area in the center here. This is where the fuel is irradiated. Or sorry, not where this is where the irradiated fuel is processed, meaning that it is basically broken down and the plutonium is separated out. In 5,000 pounds of uranium, there's about 1 pound of plutonium, right? So in all this fuel, the massive amounts of fuel that's going into the reactors, only a very small part of that is the plutonium that the Hanford operators are looking for. As again, Hanford is basically a giant factory to make plutonium. And so just less than 1% is that product that the Hanford site produces. The 200 areas is also where the majority of the waste is created. This process to dissolve the fuel elements to extract the plutonium is a very polluting process. It is not only highly radioactive, and the irradiation of the uranium creates a bevy of radionuclides, some of which have very short half-lives and are very radioactive, some of which have very long half-lives and are still dangerous to human health, to ecological health. And that is where Hanford's waste tanks are located, the 177 tanks containing roughly 56 million gallons of nuclear waste. Along with that nuclear waste, a lot of it is actually chemical waste because of all of the chemicals needed. For example, the chemicals needed to dissolve the uranium cladding, the nitric acid and things like that, things that are also very dangerous for health in general. That's where that is located. So a lot of times when a lot of the money being spent at Hanford is to treat the waste, right, to remediate groundwater along the river, to tear down facilities, but also a lot of when Hanford's in the news, it's for the tanks. And so that's where the tanks are. The tanks are in the center of the site, up on the plateau. They are several hundred feet or more above groundwater, unlike the reactors, which are down on the river. But nevertheless, the tanks are the big area of focus, the area of common concern. Lastly, the other major important area of the site is the 300 area down here by Richland. 300 area is where the fuel is made. Basically, the uranium ore is canned into slugs, and those slugs are then driven up to the reactor, loaded into the reactors. The 300 area was also a research area, but primarily research about fuel fabrication and hot cell operations, so new ways to dissolve fuel and process fuel. And there were a couple test reactors there. One to try to burn plutonium as a fuel to make energy, some things like that. So a research area, but research relating to the production of plutonium, mostly. So the research that Hanford is largely an industrial site. It's largely a production site. It is an area that output a vast amount of scientific literature about, and a vast amount of research, but all relating to the production of plutonium. So unlike Oak Ridge or Los Alamos, the two other sites of the Manhattan Project, Oak Ridge, where uranium was passed through centrifuges and gaseous diffusion to pull out U-235 to make a bomb with, that unstable element of uranium. And unlike Los Alamos, where of course all the physicists are, Oppenheimer and Fermi and so on and so forth, where they're building the bombs, Hanford is certainly the most, and I'm going to use this word again and again, in the industrial of the sites. And so it is also the one, because of its continued operation during the Cold War, and in fact the ramp up of operation, because its processes needed to be secret, because Hanford does produce 2/3 of the US nuclear weapons stockpile. We produce 2/3 of the plutonium that the United States has. It does not often get talked about in terms of with the openness that Oak Ridge and Los Alamos did, because their processes, the Oak Ridge process was abandoned after the war. The uranium separation there was not chosen because it was too inefficient to produce weapons. And of course, Los Alamos being the area of all the physicists, right, they were much more active after the war and could kind of talk some about what they did, whereas Hanford had to focus on, chose to focus on production. Production. And so it, and a lot of the knowledge about it kind of remained, some of it classified, some of it secret, and just a site of work for uranium production. Before all of this happened, this stretch of the Columbia was home, and still is home, to many different tribes in this area. And these include, but are not limited to, the Nez Perce, the Yakima, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla, Walla Walla, Cayuse, and Colville, all either called some of this area home or considered what is the Hanford site to be ancestral lands that they would travel to, trade in, lands associated with their history. And so I want to recognize that Hanford does sit on, and even WSU Tri-Cities sits on these lands, right? These in some cases, ceded lands due to treaties. In other cases, like groups like the Wanapum, non-treaty tribes, tribes that are not federally recognized, nevertheless having a strong connection to the land. The Wanapum, a very small tribe, today numbering under 100 people, nevertheless is the tribe that is probably geographically most closely associated with Hanford. They hail from the area known as Priest Rapids, which is just upstream of Hanford. And the Wanapum actually in the Sahaptin means people of the river. And so they are a tribe that also, the Wanapum leader, Johnny Buck, in 1943, met with Colonel Matthias, the operator of the site for the Manhattan District, and negotiated some access to land during the war. And so Wanapum have been involved with Hanford because, again, this is their ancestral home, and many of their significant traditional cultural properties reside on the Hanford site. Following the 1855 treaties, the creation of reservation systems, the removal of indigenous peoples from the land, comes Euro-American farmers, settlers. The White Bluffs area, which is pictured here, this picture from 1906, is one of the first areas settled, and largely because this area had been a good river crossing for millennia, but whites use it as an important river crossing to go up to gold-bearing fields in northern Idaho and northeastern Washington. It's a very sparse settlement until the passage of the Newlands Reclamation Act, which is an obscure act that did one important thing. It created the Bureau of Reclamation. It created government support for irrigation projects. And that's really what drew, the first thing that really draws people, Americans and Euro-Americans in any significant numbers is the passage of that act. And so we start to see in 1906, the Hanford Irrigation and Power Company is incorporated. They build a pump house on the river. One of the things you can see at the pre-Manhattan Project tours, they build the town of Hanford. They immediately start selling lots and trying to get people to move to the area. It's a hard go. This is a hard area to farm. In addition, a lot of the private irrigation systems failed repeatedly. And so by 1942, when the government is looking to acquire the land, there's only about 1,400 people that live in this 680 square miles. So that's, again, half the size of Rhode Island. There's only about 1,400 people that live on that. So a very rural, a very remote area, and one that was struggling, to put it bluntly. And this is kind of the the advertising, and the government, state of Washington actually advertised for these lots. The state owned a lot of land out there and was desperately trying to relieve population pressures in places like Tacoma and Seattle to get people to move here. And when they did, this is more really what they faced. They used pictures of buildings, and this brochure is full of pictures of beautiful trees and happy farmers. And this is actually a photo from a family who donated it to the Hanford White Bluffs Pioneer Association. And I think this more represents kind of what people found when they got there, right? Sagebrush covered land, right? Shrub steppe land that had to be cleared, that was incredibly sandy, incredibly hot in the winter, hot in the summer, cold in the winter, windy all the time. A very, very hard area to put under the plow to make productive. But nevertheless, some people did thrive in this area. There were some ranches like the Bruggerman Ranch, which was a over 400-acre ranch on the site, where Paul Bruggerman, a German immigrant, grew apricots, grapes, cherries, apples, had 300 head of sheep, grew asparagus, mint. So there were some people that were successful if they could get irrigation to work for them in kind of taming this land, taming to use their words. But for a lot of other folks, and if you go through the records of the buyouts, the assessments that the government gave to people, some of them are pretty pitiful. Some of them, the government assessor came in and says, well, for this person I assessed 20 acres of barren land and a shack, and we're going to pay you several $100s for that, and you can leave. And I'm sure though for people like that, they were probably like, okay, thank you, I will leave. For others like the Bruggermans, it would have been a lot harder to leave their homes. So this is actually one of these assessments right here. This kind of, and someone here obviously had a decent farm, because it looks like they have about $5,000 worth of property, land, and holdings in 1942, a decent amount. But this is sorry, let me back up. So in 1942, December 22nd, 1942, Colonel Franklin Matthias, a colonel in the Army Corps of Engineers, flies out of Pasco, flies north in Pasco. And his supervisor, General Leslie Groves, has asked him to find a site for this Hanford production works. They don't know it's called Hanford yet, but this production works. And he's been to some places in Utah and Nevada and California, and he hasn't quite found what he's looking for. He hasn't found a site that he could say will fit. And as he flies over Richland, again, pictured here in 1940, right, the bustling town of Richland, population about like 240 at this time, he sees what he's been looking for this whole time to build this massive plutonium production works. There's a river that runs year-round that's cold. It's remote, but it's remote and it's rural, and it has mountains on all sides, but it also has an important rail connection in Pasco. Pasco, at this time, in World War II, is the largest rail hub west of the Mississippi, so they know they can bring in a lot of stuff. It has electricity from the Grand Coulee Dam flowing through it. It has a lot of sandy soil, which is going to be very useful for building these massive concrete reactors and separations facilities. In short, it only has 1,400 people that the government has to evict. And so he cables his boss, and early in January of 1943, President Roosevelt signs the executive order withdrawing the land from public ownership, and the government sends out assessors to go to everybody's property and basically tell them what it's worth. And they have, depending on where you lived, you had a couple weeks to a few months to get your stuff and leave. Some people felt the assessments were not fair. Some took the government to court or asked for reappraisal. And those people that did have the means to take the government to court often got better assessments, because one thing that General Groves and Matthias wanted was to not have a lot of information about what was going to happen here in the papers. So they kind of quietly settled with people. But this nullified all claims to the land, including tribal claims to the land, of which Johnny Buck, the Wanapum leader, meets with Matthias to try to negotiate access to the land, which Matthias, to his credit, does grant until production of the reactor starts, until the reactors start up. And then the area is completely closed off and remained closed off for decades to tribal members. So this is a closer up shot of that 300 area. This is kind of where the story of plutonium production begins. And this is the 300 area in 1944 as it's under construction. This is where the fuel is made, where the uranium is coated in aluminum and sent up to the reactors, where they test out some of the separations processes. Today, most of this area is gone, save for a couple buildings that frankly required a lot of care to demolish because they're so hot, because there are areas where they tested out different separations processes, and so there's a lot of waste in those buildings, and they're really too hot to touch. But there's a lot of effort to remediate them because they're, as you can see, they're right next to the river. So the 300 area is where the story starts, in kind of my opinion, where the fuel is made. The fuel then goes up to the reactors in the 100 area. And there's a lot of photos of the reactors, right? And there's a lot of them that were even made into postcards, like this one. This is a Robley Johnson photo. And I chose this picture because it's one you don't see often. And what it emphasizes to me is that it shows to me the industrial character of this site. You can see the 25 million gallon water storage area. This is the water that is going to be fed into a water treatment plant and then into a water pressurization plant to go into the reactor. The reactor is actually, you see the stack of the reactor right here, it's that small building behind the plant. So some of these buildings on this site, including the water pressurization plant, the coal-fired power plant, are actually bigger than the reactor themselves. And the reactor is 8 stories tall, right? The reactor block itself is a 45-foot by 45-foot cube. So it's not a small building, but these were massive industrial sites, right? And all focused around keeping the reactor running. And the enemy of these reactors is heat. And that's why all of this water is needed to cool the reactor. They had not designed it to be a closed loop system, which, as I mentioned before, means that all of the all of the water run through the reactor is sent to cool for a period and then discharged back into the river. They treated the water to remove as many impurities as they could. So the water would be, in their minds, the least radioactive. And often they were successful in that, but sometimes if a fuel element ruptures, that water is going to take that irradiated uranium and all of its byproducts with it. In addition, the reactors used a lot of chemicals to prevent corrosion in the tubes, in the steel tubes that the fuel sat in the reactor. And so those chemicals also get flushed out with it. And so with the operation, and the reactors like B reactor operates from 1944 to 1968, pretty much continuously. And so over time, these reactors accumulate a lot of what the DOE classifies as low-level waste. And that's a whole story in and of itself, but they classify it as low-level waste. But basically, chemicals, some radionuclides that do get discharged into the river. In addition, the water is, even though they let the water sit, the water is warmer than the river temperature, and so they are discharging warmer water into the river. And it's according to what I've read, in the mid-50s, at the peak of production, when 8 reactors are operating, the temperature of the river goes up by about 1.2 to 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that definitely. And the Hanford managers were worried about the effects on the river. They do fly in several salmon biologists from the University of Washington to study what the effects might be on the salmon. But their concern and the concern of operators in the 40s and 50s and 60s was really one of production, because they were being tasked with producing plutonium. And it was also one that, where they were concerned about the environment, it was more to limit the amount of radioactivity in the environment to protect workers, but also to limit any kind of fear in the surrounding population, right? And so to keep it, and this is also why Hanford did not aggressively monitor areas outside of the Hanford site for radiation, so the public would not ask questions about what was going on at Hanford. And so because the few times they did send people out with Geiger counters to go through people's fields, people started wondering what the heck was going on. And that's something that Hanford managers obviously wanted to avoid, because their prime goal during the war and afterwards is to produce plutonium. Hanford was very concerned about protection for its workers, as I'll kind of show you later. Although again, where that protection is concerned, it was often about keeping workers safe so workers could be productive. And to not be ahistorical, we do have to recognize that in the 1940s and early 50s, the attitude of industry about pollution was often that dilution was the solution to pollution. Most industries accepted that wastewater and things could be diluted out, right? And there was not the kind of environmental consciousness we have today. And I don't say that to kind of absolve Hanford decision makers of any responsibility, but to say that Hanford operated in those years, from roughly, I would say 1944 to the early 50s, in industrial guidelines that had been established for similar industries. And Hanford represents a challenge to its operators because it's the first time where radiation is produced at an industrial level and treated as an industrial hazard. Before Hanford, radiation hazards had mostly existed in a laboratory, right? As Glenn Seaborg is isolating plutonium in 1942. As Enrico Fermi is kind of loading up his first reactor in the Chicago Pile 1. They're dealing with very small, as Marie Curie in the early 20th century has isolated radium. They're dealing with very small amounts of radiation, whereas these reactors are producing amounts of plutonium over 1 million times what Glenn Seaborg had produced in 1942, right? This is industrial scale. And so they created an industrial monitoring program, but one that was clearly not, one that had to learn as they went. And it's in those early years, you can see that they're learning as they go, because for example, in the war, and I'll move to the next because we'll talk about what happens here. This is the 200 area. This is the process canyon, the T plant, where the irradiated fuel goes in, and basically a plutonium slurry comes out. Initially, they let fuel cool for 30 days. After it's irradiated in the reactor, the transmutation goes on. The fuel is very hot, thermally and radiologically. They let it cool for 30 days. By 1946, 47, they're increasing that to 60 days. By the 50s, they're increasing it to 90 days. And why did they do that? Well, processing 30-day fuel results in an immense amount of radionuclides coming out of these stacks. And in World War II, and in 1946, these stacks had no filters. So Hanford's biggest releases, over 94% of the radiological material released at Hanford occurs before 1947, right? And especially most of it in World War II, as they're furiously trying to produce enough plutonium to build first the Trinity bomb, the first ever explosion of a nuclear device, and then later the Nagasaki bomb, Fat Man, the one that is dropped on Nagasaki. But as they're going along, they're realizing, as they're doing monitoring around the site, they're realizing that immense amounts of radiation are depositing around these areas. And where that interferes with operations is that it's going to mess up their counts inside the building, right? You can't have equipment, you can't monitor for leaks, for radiological leaks inside your building, or where the presence is of a certain type of radiation if you are spewing so much radiation into the surrounding area, right? Workers are it's gonna be on cars, it's gonna be in plants, it's gonna be on their clothes. And so where they make these changes, it's an attempt to keep workers safe, but also to keep production going. And it's the same approach to waste. The idea is they'll build these waste tanks, they'll put the waste in it, and once Hanford shuts down, they'll deal with the waste problem. The problem for us in dealing with that waste now is Hanford doesn't shut down for decades, right? And so we accumulate decades of this kind of attitude of that will be someone else's problem. And it is now all of our problems. But Hanford eventually does, by 1947, 48, they're installing filters on these stacks. They're realizing the danger, and they're also increasing the cooling time. One of Hanford's most notorious events happens actually after World War II, and it's something called the Green Run. And it's an event that was kept secret until the mid-1980s when investigative journalists and downwinders kind of worked to uncover what had happened at Hanford. And what the Green Run was the military was basically asked the Hanford operators to process green fuel. Fuel they knew was too ripe to be processed, I'll put it that way, too green, right? Had not cooled enough to be safe, did not meet safety standards. Why did they do that? Well, in early 1949, the Soviets, right, had detonated an H-bomb. We know the Soviets had a bomb. And what the military wanted to do was they wanted to have Hanford process green fuel, and they would fly planes over the Hanford site and take measurements of the radiation. They could take those measurements and fly planes over the Soviet Union and take measurements there and try to figure out how much plutonium the Soviets are producing. Because we knew the Soviets were like we had done in World War II, we know the Soviets are processing green fuel. They had a much more lax safety record, let's put it that way. They used slave labor to build their facilities. They did not protect their workers. They discharged waste into lakes, into still moving water. They sacrificed a lot of their own people and their own environment to try to keep up with America's atomic bomb production. When Hanford agreed to do this, it had agreed to a certain set of conditions in the weather, that there would be no clouds, that the stuff would be able to go up in the atmosphere. A problem is that a temperature inversion happened. Clouds rolled in. And Hanford wanted to cancel the test, but the military said no. So they went ahead with the test anyway. And they processed this green fuel, and it got basically the fumes, the stack gases, were trapped over the mid-Columbia. And a lot of that radiation, including iodine-131, radioactive iodine, fell over the area. And the government did not inform the local population. And this marks, the Green Run is such an important event in Hanford history, and one that is so shocking and so upsetting because it's basically uninformed consent, right? It's human subject research without any kind of informed consent, and one that Hanford kept secret. And one that went against their policy, right? And how they operated. But was deemed a national security need. And of course, because of the temperature inversion, the military got no useful data from it, to top it all off, right? They didn't even get the data. Not that the data is that important, but they didn't even get it. So as I mentioned before, to deal with all of this waste, this radioactive slurry cocktail, Hanford creates waste tanks. At first they build single-shelled tanks, again, thinking that this is a war project, and after the war, they will do something with this waste, right? They only needed to store it for a few years. And to their credit, they designed tanks that were going to last, that in their mind would last at least a couple decades, right? That not just short term. They actually put a lot of thought into the construction of these single-shell tanks. They put them over concrete pads, right? They were very exact in their welds, but they were not meant to be long-term storage. And considering that they weren't, they've served us pretty well, because there have been leaks in these tanks and some of the double-shelled tanks, but they were constructed at least with the idea that it would be better to construct them very safely, to over-engineer them, than to treat the waste or just to discharge the waste into the ground. Hanford also, as part of its concern over workers and the environment, very quickly on, after the initial salmon studies, where they do try to study the effects of radioactivity on salmon and salmon spawning, Hanford creates a biology department. And this farm, which is next to the F reactor, later grows into the Pacific Northwest National Labs that Battelle operates. But it starts off as a pretty modest farm where biologists measured the radioactivity on the radioactive intake and skin contamination on animals, mostly pigs, sheep, and cows, in order to try to determine where things like plutonium travel in the body, what plutonium does to skin, and try to extrapolate that data onto people. So again, using animal research to try to develop safeguards and standards for Hanford workers. And this is obviously something of grave importance to Hanford. And again, it's the support for this really grows in the 50s and it ends up in the establishment of the Pacific Northwest National Lab, which of course today PNNL does a wide variety of things, most of which are not connected to Hanford, but its beginnings are here in this basically converted Quonset hut as an animal farm. And that the pig part will be important at the very end. There will be a callback to that. So to build these facilities, DuPont, which is the contractor during the Manhattan Project, hires 120,000 people, of which about 50,000 of them live at the Hanford construction camp, with rows and rows of barracks, a trailer court of over 7,000 trailers, the largest trailer park in the world. This camp, this town of 50,000 people in 1944 is the fourth largest city in Washington state. It has the second two-lane highway built in Washington state to connect it to the town of Richland. That's how many people and materials are moving through this area. The work camp was a segregated space. The military was segregated. The surrounding communities expected segregation, even though Washington had no segregation laws. DuPont had, as a federal contractor, had to hire a percentage of its workforce as African American to comply with the Fair Employment Practices Commission. And so it did. So the barracks are segregated, the mess halls are segregated, the work is segregated in these facilities. And they're not only segregated by race, but they're also segregated by gender. And actually here, sorry, I forgot I cut that part out. And so one interesting thing that's not segregated in this area is sports. There is an all-black team, baseball team, and an all-white, a couple all-white teams, but they actually play together, which was not something that happened in America at large. The national leagues were segregated until Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier. While the work is segregated during the Manhattan Project, and even for a few years after, the pay was equal. That was another thing the Fair Employment Practices Commission demanded, was that DuPont pay people equally. African Americans were generally only hired for laborer jobs, general construction, but they were paid equal to whites. And this was a reason why these tens of thousands of people came to the area, and many of them stayed. In fact, so many stayed to work at Hanford and to work in dam construction elsewhere that by 1950, 20% of Pasco is African American. That's the largest per capita African American population in the entire Pacific Northwest. And it's a rural area. Pasco's rural, but it's an important part of the great migration of African Americans from the South to all places north and east and west. Many of them come. One gentleman I interviewed for my second book, Echoes of Exclusion, talked about his father. So this gentleman I interviewed, Vanis Daniels, his father, Vanis Daniels Sr., was a sharecropper in Kildare, Texas, and a brakeman for the Southern Pacific Railroad. And he supported, somehow, in 1943, he supported 8 kids and a couple nieces and nephews on $13 a week, right? Plus his share crop. He took a job as a foreman, making $1.25 an hour, working 60-hour weeks with a day off. And one of the things that Vanis told me his dad struggled with was what to do with his day off. and what to do with breaks. They weren't used to taking mandated breaks in a day. And he said his dad, the first time he heard that he was supposed to go take a break, he was like, what am I going to do for that 15 minutes? Not work? But that kind of wages were transformative for African Americans, and a major reason why so many stayed, and in fact brought their families up, a series of chain migrations that continued on through the 1960s and resulted in Pasco being a really important nexus of black community in the inland Northwest, with a very thriving African American population. Richland, by contrast, transforms from kind of the sleepy agrarian town to this atomic utopia village of Hanford workers. To live in Richland during the years of government control from 1943 to 1958, to live in Richland, you had to work at Hanford or be contracted with the AEC to provide services to people that worked at Hanford. And so, while Richland was not a closed city, Oak Ridge, Los Alamos are closed cities. They're fenced. You have to have a pass to get in. Richland's not like that. But Richland it's not a secret city, but I call it a secretive city, right? Because people that worked at Hanford did not they didn't bring their families to work. They didn't talk about their work. And while if you could drive into Richland and take a drive around, why would you be there if you didn't know someone there, right? It was a semi-closed city. It was a city of 100% employment, right? Everyone that lives there works at Hanford or works for the AEC. And so people that we interviewed that grew up in Richland in this era described this utopia, right? Where everyone, had what they needed, right? Everyone, they went to these great schools and they had all these activities and they played in the river and all this stuff. But they of course mentioned more interesting things like nobody knew what their dads did. Their dads just got on a bus and went to work and came home, and no one knew what that meant. And so it's and one of the things that's most interesting is folks that we interviewed who left Richland to go to college say, always remember the first moment where someone asked them about what growing up is like in Richland, and they talk about that, and they talk about their dads leaving and coming back, and they start to realize how different they were. Because when you're in Richland, you grow up there, you don't realize how weird that is, right? Because everyone is like that, right? Everyone works on this thing that no one talks about. But for the folks that went off to college or left, they started to realize, like, no, this is really strange, right? Our mascot is an atom, is a mushroom cloud. That's really strange. It's still not that strange to people from Richland, but Hanford, DuPont, Manhattan Project construct houses for their workers, and these are very fancy of the day housing. DuPont insists on a level of housing that is going to be that's going to keep its workers comfortable. And here's where some early tension comes between DuPont and the Manhattan and the Army Corps, because this is supposed to just be a wartime project, right? And so the Army says, we're just going to build a bunch of barracks, and DuPont says, you're crazy if you think our people are going to live in barracks. These people have families, right? Many of these scientists and engineers. And so they compromise and they build what are called alphabet houses. These are houses with Douglas fir, timbers, and they're basically state of the art. Architecturally, they're a little plain. They're what's called traditional, minimalist traditional, right? You can see some elements, but they're pretty plain. But they're very high quality housing for the Hanford workers, for the people that are going to be running the facilities. And what DuPont's trying to do, and later General Electric, who takes over the project after DuPont, they're trying to create, again, this kind of a utopia, this kind of domestic bliss, the suburb. Hanford is an atomic suburb. And this is kind of the image, I think, that DuPont and General Electric is looking for, right? The white picket fence, right? The women at home while their husbands are away doing, they can only imagine because they can't talk about it or they don't know anything. But it's not enough. And there's a lot of more working class jobs at the site. And DuPont can't build houses fast enough, so they actually get housing from the Tennessee Valley Authority, relief housing, prefabricated temporary units that they put around the city of Richland. They don't put them in the neighborhoods of the nice alphabet houses. They create this class barrier, right, between who lives in an alphabet and who lives in a prefab. And these prefabricated units, which were relief housing, were only meant to last, to be temporary dwellings, are still in existence. And they now routinely sell for more than $250,000 because that's how crazy housing is in 2022. For prefabricated unit, like plywood walls, right? Not a marker of quality in 1944. I chose this image because this is Johnny Tuamalash and Johnny Buck, two Wanapum elders kind of outside the gate. And this to me speaks of the exclusion of the site, right? By the time Hanford's operating, it is excluding people. And this image is thanks to the Wanapum Heritage Center. So by 1945, August of 1945, the news is out, right? At least they can talk about what was made at Hanford, even if they don't talk about the specifics of what people do. These are two newspapers, the one on the right from August 6th, kind of releasing the details, and then of course from August 14th, the surrender of Japan. These are both from the Richland Villager, so this Richland, Oregon. By 1948, by the early Cold War, Hanford, which was supposed to be a wartime project, is now fully in operation. And in fact, it's expanding. They're going from 3 reactors to 8. And the town itself is growing. And interestingly, the town is kind of this town with this very short history, right, where everyone who lives in Richland, by 1948, the person that had lived in Richland the longest would have only been there 4 years, right? They'd all come in 43 or 44 to work there. So this is a town of people from all across the United States, of all different backgrounds, but all roughly around the same ages, in their 20s to their 50s, right? A town where no one has any extended family, no one's grandparents or parents live in Richland. Nevertheless, they're looking for some kind of identity. They're looking for something to way to tell their own story. Really interestingly to me, they choose Western themes, right? They see themselves as pioneers, right? That they're the pioneers. And of course, what I love about this image is it's like an onion. There's so many layers here. Because what do we know about pioneering? Well, pioneers did not go into an empty West, right? That West had been populated by indigenous tribes. That there had been violence with, conflict, war, and violence were a central part of the story of the West. Just like war and violence are a central part of the story of Hanford. Although I don't think they're critically reflecting on that in 1948. But they see themselves as they saw the Oregon Trail pioneers before, right? But that they're going to build something new. Notice the centrality of the atom. And notice what the atom is pushing away. It's pushing away industry. It's pushing away of past, of what appears to be kind of pollution and urbanization into a new West. Yet these are all people that are operating nuclear reactors, right? They're all burning coal in their nice new Alphabet House furnaces. They have this community built for them. But nevertheless, they see themselves as pioneers. And in that way, they actually fit nicely into the story of the West. Story of violence, of war, of government support, but of narratives of pioneering and going it alone, right? Of preserving. They leave us this interesting, uncritical kind of look at who they are. Just 1 year later, this is one of my favorites here on the left. This is from the second Atomic Frontier days. And it says, hard hats and assault masks in the Northwest desert. They are our atomic pioneers, right? And I love the image, of course, of the people in their Hanford work gear superimposed over this beautiful shot of Rattlesnake Mountain and the shrub steppe. And again, another celebration of who they are, right? This dichotomy of the natural landscape and the industrial work. I guess they must not have been as scared of gas masks as I feel people today are. Maybe they've been used in movies too much, but they kind of signify like danger, right? I mean, that's why you wear one. I don't understand it, but I'm glad it. And then, of course, not everyone in Hanford also draws a lot of young men. As Hanford is rapidly expanding, it needs all these young engineers to to run its facilities. And these young engineers, many of them that we interviewed, lived in barracks their first couple years before they, met a nice girl and settled down and didn't talk about their job. Many of them lived in barracks, and many of them described how much fun it was to move to Richland. That they left college, they left the dorm, they left the frat, and they basically went into another frat, but where they all had money because they all had nice paying jobs working out at Hanford. And you could see how some of them chose to spend their time standing proudly next to the cases of Olympia beer. Hanford is also a place where, because the work is largely done by men, gender plays a very important role. Gender is used, of course, to sell safety, right? Not tonight, Joe, I'm all tied up with Fire Prevention Week. But women's work is also recognized in the limited roles women were allowed to play, right? And this says, without them, it wouldn't have been possible. And what are they doing? The important office work, right, that women were restricted to clerical work. And then, of course, part of Atomic Frontier Days was pageantry, right, with Wild West themes. Again, kind of like celebrating sex and virginity, right? Celebrating this kind of, this gendered view of who the community is and kind of what is popular. And this is my favorite of all of these gendered images, is the old keep your mind on your work, not the wiggle, right, with the lady in the nice dress with the cigarette. But again, right, marketed solely to men, right? And talking, and using sex to sell, to basically sell safety, right? To impose safety on people. Race is another figure. As I mentioned, African Americans were brought to Hanford. They took jobs at Hanford. They had to live in segregated facilities, and for those that stayed, they had to live in segregated East Pasco. East Pasco was, up until the mid-1960s, had no streetlights, it had no sewers. Most people did not have running water in their homes. Many cooked on wooden stoves. Meanwhile, contrast that to the nice new alphabet houses where people are living. In addition, Richland, like many other communities all across the north and the south and the east and the west, you kind of put on popular entertainment of its day, right, including blackface. Nevertheless, not maybe remembering that thousands of African Americans lived in Pasco, but also showing how segregated these two spaces were, right? Richland is a town that's almost all white. Kennewick, there's a few black residents of Richland, but Kennewick, where I live, is a town that was completely white until 1965, until the first black family moved in, part of desegregation efforts. So from its very beginning, right, in 1944, Hanford is enforcing a segregation that was not required by law in Washington state. And culminating in the mid-1960s, cover of our second book, is an NAACP protest in downtown Kennewick against segregated facilities and mostly segregated housing. The Kennewick Police Department was proud that Kennewick was, quote, a lily white town. The old Green Bridge connecting Pasco and Kennewick had a sign on it notifying residents that it was a sundown town, that African Americans had to be out by sundown. And this was a major focus of the NAACP and the Congress on Civil Rights, or CORE, to desegregate this area. And as you can see by who's in this photo, this was also an important interracial coalition, right, of black civil rights activists and white allies who marched together to put an end to segregationist practices. Of course, duck and cover was an important part, and especially because Hanford was a major target for atomic weapons. You can imagine the drills that they would have put school children through. These next few images are from a safety primer. This was a booklet given out by the AEC to workers, and this was meant for more blue-collar workers. And they used cartoons to sell safety, but also to really put the onus on safety on the worker, with the kind of narrative that these were safe places, and that and you would only get hurt if you didn't follow the rules. So we can go through this together. Employees who obey rules can work a lifetime safely in this plant. Radiation hazards are measured with special instruments. Engineers checked exhaust hoods to reduce dust exposure. You will receive a medical examination at regular intervals. It's true, nuclear workers are often some of the healthiest workers in the United States because they receive more medical care than the general population, which leads to a bias in their own, and in the safety of work performed at nuclear sites, because these regular medical examinations often catch diseases before they become more advanced, like cancer. The radiation you receive is measured by film badges or dosimeters. Records are carefully kept. For the type of radiation hazard required, all work clothes are provided and washed by the plant. You are the keystone of your safety. You must cooperate. Is it safe to work here? The answer is up to you, right? Again, flipping that onus onto the worker, right? That this is by default safe. Interesting. By 1964, Hanford is running 9 reactors. This is a panorama of the 9 reactors in the distance. By the mid-1980s, frankly, the US has more plutonium than it needs. In fact, it had more plutonium than it really needed in the 1960s. We had an advantage of 4 to 5 to 1 on the Soviet Union in terms of nuclear weapons. Kennedy was lying when he said we had a missile gap. We had a missile glut, and the US kept producing. Nevertheless, by the mid-1980s, as I mentioned before, investigative journalists and downwinders had begun to bring claims against the DOE, then running the site, now still running the site, the agency running the site, and were advocating to shut the site down. In April of 1986, the Chernobyl plant in Ukraine explodes after a safety test that they performed that was anything but safe. And of course, all eyes are on Hanford's lone remaining reactor, the N reactor, which was down for an outage and is now the target of activists locally, nationwide, and a coalition of groups to shut Hanford down. In response, Hanford workers form the Hanford family, which sounds like a cult. Maybe it is, no, it's not. But I know many people that were involved in this, so I won't say it's a cult, but it was a group of, it was a conservative grassroots effort to save Hanford from shutting down, to save their jobs, right? To save and to quote, protect America, right? And protect Hanford. And what's interesting is they took the tactics of grassroots groups. They called senators. They wrote letters to the editor. They engaged with anti-nuclear activists. They held talks. They wrote opinions. They traveled to Olympia to get in front of legislators with their message. To stop Hanford bashing, right? To protect America. Unfortunately, they were like, you know, like a small dam trying to hold back a tsunami, right? The momentum was so far against them, and not only that, but really, as the Cold War was dragging to an end, as Gorbachev and the Soviets and instigated perestroika and glasnost, the openness, the need for these weapons was declining until there was no need for increased plutonium production. And so in that way, they're kind of a traditionalist force against the march of history. And as they go away, but they leave us these interesting pictures, we start to focus on Hanford cleanup. And many groups are formed to do several things, to protest Hanford, to try to get money for Hanford cleanup, to try to hold the government accountable, and to raise the attention to the massive danger of the waste that sits at Hanford. That is currently the target of $2+ billion a year of federal spending. And this group here, Hanford Challenge, is still going strong, right? Still advocating, working with the Hanford Advisory Board and other groups to keep the attention on cleanup, the money coming for cleanup, and the work going on cleanup. And this is kind of where the site is now. It is a managed site by the Department of Energy, where about 8,000 people work in various things. I am one of those many, kind of preserving the history of Hanford in this way, trying to tell the story of it. And but also the B reactor pictured here is part of the Manhattan Project National Historical Park, and in a small part, one part of Hanford transitions to preservation and to history, and a place where we can learn. And I do encourage you, if you can, to come take a tour of the B reactor, to see the world's first nuclear reactor, and to really come to the site and kind of learn some of these stories in more detail. It's a fascinating place to come. And that's where I'll leave it. This is one of the pigs that they did experiments on. The biology group were kind of a sick group of guys. They were mostly guys, in that this is actually one of their photoshops. This is a photo that somebody altered, one of the biologists in the 1950s, but I use it as my ending slide because the moment I came across it, I was like, this is perfect. This is macabre, it's a little disturbing, it's a little funny, it's morally dubious, and that to me is a lot of the things that Hanford is and why I find it such an interesting place to study historically. So I will turn it over for questions. Yeah.
I had a friend that did a lot of biological surveys out of Hanford in the late 70s through the 80s. He was looking at native bird populations. And he discovered that there were several large plumes of tritium that were in groundwater there.
Yep.
And the birds seemed to know it.
Really?
Yeah. He found fewer birds where the tritium was,
Interesting.
and many more where it wasn't. But the interesting thing was when he started this research, he was told by DOE that there were no plumes.
Well, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And his whole research was well funded because they were out to prove it didn't exist.
Right. Right.
And then when he found it, it was like, no more of this.
Agencies like the DOE are interesting because they often don't always know their own history or the scope of their own activities. It was common practice up until the mid-'80s for low-level waste to first dump it into the ground, right? That was and that was an industrial standard for decades in this country. But then they would crib waste, and a crib is basically a concrete trough with sand that they dump the waste in. They put a concrete slab over it, and then they roll over it with a bulldozer. And like when you take a nice sandwich and you mush it together to compact all the flavors together, the idea is that it'll kind of create a sarcophagus. But that it's not perfect because you've just cracked all your concrete. But that was waste disposal until the mid-'80s, probably when efforts like your friends encouraged DOE to stop it. And one of my favorite documents or series of documents in my collection is one I got from a third-party individual, Bill Kennedy, who was a health physicist on site. And he created a binder called The Absurd History of the DOE. And what is in The Absurd History of the DOE is all of the memos from this process where they finally turned against low-level waste disposal by cribbing, where they start off with all these memos where they say, well, it never happened, and then they acknowledge it happened, but that it meets regs, and then when the regs change, what they have to do to meet the new regs changing, and how absurd it is that they start with saying this never happened to ending with, well, we would never do that because it's totally unsafe. So, yeah, it's a little absurd.
I was going to say that in addition to the atomic energy industry, there are other industries that do the same thing. I'm from Nevada, and if you look up Kimberly, Nevada on Google Earth, it's nothing. And that at one time was one of the largest Kennecott copper mines, and they had Lower Kimberly, Middle Kimberly, Upper Kimberly, school buses that took you to Ruth when they closed the school.
Yep.
Now it's just a disaster area. And
Yep.
Butte, Montana has a government-regulated disaster area from the copper mines. What I'm saying is that this kind of thing isn't just relegated
Oh, no.
to
No.
plutonium and atomic energy.
No, not at all. A lot of the safety managers and people that were responsible for waste disposal at Hanford came from the mining industry. And the mining industry, for most of its inception, had discharged wastewater, right? Often laced with things like cyanide and other things that were, especially gold mining, incredibly hazardous, discharged. And since so much of that processing in that canyon is hydroengineering, they used people from the mining industry. And that's where those gas masks and a lot of the safety equipment comes from the mining industry, one very dangerous industry, very concerned with worker safety and that safe workers dig up more ore and make the mine more money, just like safe Hanford workers produce more plutonium, right, and fulfill that need. And so, yeah, it's that's where I think what the waste at Hanford is different because of the unique product, but the ways it was created, the attitudes towards creating it are the same as in many other industries. And so in that way, it's not an exceptional, to me, it's not an exceptional failure in terms of how it was created, but it's exceptional in its makeup is what makes it so different. But it's easy to see why they did it because that's what industries did.
You go to West Virginia and look at the coal mining industry.
Exactly.
You can probably go to every state and find an equal opportunity or whatever you want to call
Exactly.
it, disaster.
Exactly. Yeah.
I was born in originally 1954 and left in 73 when I went off to college. I was born in Quonset Hutch, they called Cadillac at the time.
Yep.
Interesting.
My son was born in Cadillac.
Were the unions and the part they played in the efficiency and the non-efficiency of Hanford. And what got in between there was a paper called the Tri-City Herald, which was not a union paper, started in Pasco,
Right.
in Kennewick.
Right.
There's a book called Tiger by the Tail.
Yep. By Glenn, what's his name? Yes.
My dad was a machinist out in the 300 area. If they wanted to find out what was going on, they did look to the Villager, which was the mouthpiece of AEC.
Right.
They looked to the Tri-City Herald.
Right.
And they tried to get rid of the Tri-City Herald a bunch of times.
Yep.
But the people, the working class people there, they really wanted to know what was going on. That's where they went to the Herald.
Yeah, they did. And the secretive nature of Hanford, meant that for a lot of the people that, kind of put their jobs, put them on the line, they were often some of the least informed. And they were monitored, they had radiation monitors, but it's questionable of what full consent or full knowledge they had. And it's especially hard when you talk to people who are children of these folks who their parents may have been okay with those risks, but their children weren't, right? Because that means they lost a parent early or they watched a parent suffer in older age. And that's really where, things really start to become real. For me, when I'm talking to people, and just in part of the story that really humanizes it is that, I've talked to people who have been sick by Hanford and still would not change a decision they made. And that to me is perplexing because I'm like, well, I don't know if I would make that choice, but they made it with consent. And so, yeah, and that,
Full body counters every year.
yeah,
A single wide trailer to Marsh Elementary School kids.
yep.
Laid us down.
That trailer's still there. We're trying to collect it, but it costs a lot of money. Yeah,
Data,
yeah. Yeah. It becomes it's interesting how emotional and personal like those narratives weave into the story. That's one of the things that keeps me interested in Hanford. Any other? Yeah, go for it.
I assume there must have been speculation and theorizing around it. How much of that is there? Is that recorded? Or?
You mean about what went on?
Yeah.
Like during the war or afterwards?
Or I guess either.
Well, so obviously after its atomic bombs, like everyone knows that that Richland changes its mascot from a beaver to be a mushroom cloud, right? Everybody knows this place produces plutonium, and even they don't always call it plutonium. The workers called it product. Like you were not allowed to write down the word plutonium in a lot of cases. They would talk about product, and so people knew, but no one knew like what their dad did. Like they might know their dad is a chemical engineer, but the dad's not going to be like, oh, well, I work at the Purex plant, and at the Purex plant, we do. So there was, it's like not secret, but it's secretive. Whereas during the war, less than 1% of people would have known. I mean, there were so many changes going on during the war that DuPont was and the physicists at the Met Lab in Chicago were sometimes changing plans for processes mid construction. They were flying out new blueprints every day. And so only a very few number of people knew what was going on. And that was really, would have been really disorienting to the people building it because they're building these reactors or these separate facilities to really exacting tolerances. Like the graphite laid in the reactor is laid together in differences of 1/100th of a millimeter, right? Which is an exceptionally tight thing. The way they're machining this graphite has to be nearly straight. And many of them wondered, what are we doing with this graphite? One really interesting story that I'll use to close this off is, in the 90s, the group that I'm president of interviewed a lot of old timers, guys that had been there in the 1940s, the Manhattan Project. And one of them was this guy, Bud Ryan, who was a supply quartermaster. And he told this story of being out at the reactor as they are unloading boxes going in, and what they're unloading is Kotex. Kotex pads. Kotex pads were used in the nuclear industry for decades because they are absorbent. They would take samples with them, smears. They found a liquid on the ground, you don't know what it is, get your Kotex, lift it up. If you want to take a sample of a wall, get your Kotex, swipe it, measure it, because they're absorbent. And because they already existed and they were high quality, the government just ordered them in mass. But he overhears these two guys and they're like, there's no women out here. What are we doing? What is this thing making? And it's really funny, if you talk to HPTs, guys that worked out there in the 70s, 80s, they'll be like, oh yeah, Kotex. Yeah, it was part of their gear. Like they would just have boxes of it in their offices because it was industry standard, which to me is another very interesting intersection of gender and gendered products in the nuclear industry. But that's kind of, yeah, during the war, very few. After the war, generally, but no details, right? You just know Hanford's making plutonium, and not even bombs. The plutonium is taken to places like Pantex or Rocky Flats to be fashioned into weapons. So just the raw material, which is, the most important part of the bomb, but the raw material. Yeah, way in the back.
Thank you. After Chernobyl, a lot of us living outside of the cities became very interested in the necessity to stop production.
Yeah.
And cleanup. And at the time, there was a lot of resistance to the idea of cleanup as providing an economic base for the whole industry, because there was obviously a lot to do. And I'm really wondering, your story kind of stops before this century. And I'm wondering what the attitudes are now toward cleanup. I know one thing that has happened, and again, I don't know where all the decisions are made, is that a lot of cleanup was done by redefining what was dangerous waste that needed to be cleaned up.
Right, high level versus low level. Yeah.
So, yes,
Yeah.
suddenly became low level and not just wasn't necessarily good.
Right.
How do you understand what people in the industry are thinking about now?
So one thing I'll say is, as a historian, I do have to stop somewhere. And so considering that we're in cleanup, I'm actively trying to collect artifacts and material about cleanup, but we can't quite tell the story yet. So I do stop in the 1990s just because of, one, to kind of put a date on it, but two, to kind of leave room for the future and the present. But that being said, you see from the Hanford family that initially people working at Hanford were against the shutdown. And it does take a few years in the signing of the Tri-Party and really for the DOE and the local politicians to kind of be led into this idea that, hey, cleanup's going to take a long time, and if we can make the case for Hanford deserving of cleanup, we'll receive money for a long time. And in fact, we spend more on cleanup every year than we ever did to make plutonium. And so once that kind of percolated in the local business community, and then the union leaders saw that their jobs would be secure, and that the workforce would change, but also a lot of those union jobs like pipe fitters, boiler makers, electricians, they would all be needed in cleanup. And so once there was kind of an attitude shift beginning in the 90s, and there was, like when World War II ended, there was the fear that Hanford would shut down, but the Cold War meant that Hanford was going to expand. There was that initial fear, and in fact in the late 80s, housing prices in the Tri-Cities plummeted, people left, and people were extra scared because the WHOOPS project, the Washington Public power supply system project had defaulted in the 80s and had taken with it a lot of people's jobs and housing values. And so there was that same kind of fear. But by the mid to late 90s, there's that the regulations are coming in force to force the DOE to clean up Hanford, and then there's that congressional support, and it becomes a big budget item. And so that's really where you start to see the kind of local community attitude shift to embracing cleanup as a source of economic. And I think that's not to say that it's judged purely in the Tri-Cities as economics. I mean, someone who lives there, and I'm not from the Tri-Cities originally, someone who lives there, like, I'm invested in cleanup in terms of like, I want it cleaned up. And I think a lot of people there want it cleaned up, but there's also a large recognition that a lot of the continued prosperity of the Tri-Cities is because of cleanup. And so there's been that acceptance to cleanup because it's allowed the prosperity to kind of keep going. But that's not to say it doesn't have good intentions. It's just the process of it is ongoing is I guess the best word I'll use for that, because it's not something I know a ton about, but it certainly is fraught. It's fraught, and it is slow. We failed targets, right? Hanford has consistently failed, and part of that is a lot of that is the waste itself and the technology needed to capture it, and you know, there's a lot of reasons why it's slow, but it's frustratingly slow.
Wasn't it a lot of it? I mean, when they started it, they just wanted to make some bombs and end the war and do that, and they weren't really concerned about cleanup potential. I mean,
No.
we just go make this stuff, and oh, we got this, we'll toss it over here.
Right.
And then you have the irony that had they been thinking about that when they first started, the cleanup might be over by now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and you know, as the site expands in the early Cold War, you see this idea of, I mean, they're really just trying to find tanks to put the waste in, and they end up building a lot more, right? And it's just about, and you see from the internal memos that they're concerned about the waste, but it is not all of their efforts are focused on plutonium production. And so there's clearly concern about it, but there's no action behind the concern because it's something that they're not being asked to do, right? They're just being asked to create waste inadvertently.
All right, everyone, let's give Robert a round of applause.
Thank you. Sorry, I did go over. My apologies.
So Robert brought with him some of the books that he's written. These are available on the Wazoo Press website, on Amazon, and also at the B Reactors gift store.
Yep.
And thank you again so much for coming, Robert. Thank you everyone who attended. If you could
Thank
get
you very
those
much.